What would you do if somebody took the life of someone you love? In these times, one of the only ways you might feel slightly comforted is when their killer sees justice. But what if that didn't happen? Unfortunately, the reality is that sometimes these criminals manage to evade the consequences of their actions. And so for today's video, I wanted to talk about 5 different cases where heinous killers evaded justice and seemingly vanished into thin air. In the 1990s, the small town of Athol, Idaho would see a large jump in population growth. From the beginning to the end of this decade, the population would grow 95%, from 346 to 676. With this small headcount, Atholans pride themselves on being a close-knit community and a good place to raise their children, with the cornerstone of the city being the Silverwood theme park. Like many other couples, husband and wife Vern and Connie Henry would call Athol home, and they would raise 5 children together. Eventually, their oldest son would move away from home for university. By all community accounts, they were a loving couple, and neighbors have described the Henry family as incredibly friendly, upstanding members of the community. The Henrys' positive reputation is part of the reason why what happened on the night of the 11th of August, 1996, would shock the community. At 12:45 a.m., a call be made to 911 from the Henry house. When the emergency services arrived, they would be met with the startling sight of Connie and her 18-year-old daughter Heather on the ground in pools of blood. The authorities would investigate the house and find all of the Henry family members were present in the home, except for one, Vernon. The call to 911 was made by the 12-year-old son, and the police would interview the boy to get a clear picture of what happened that night. Reports indicate, on that night, Vernon would get into an argument with his wife and daughter. The boy was asleep in the bedroom, but he would be woken up by the commotion. He would listen intently, though unable to perfectly hear what was being said. The argument was clearly heated, with Vernon growing more and more irate. Vernon would then do the unthinkable. He grabbed a pistol and shot his own wife and daughter. After hearing the gunshots, though the young boy was terrified, he would exit his room and find his mother and sister laying on the ground in pools of blood. Then a sound coming from outside the house would catch his attention. He would look up and see his father peeling out of the driveway in the family car. The boy would then call 911. The 2 women had suffered multiple gunshot wounds to the chest, and unfortunately would succumb to their injuries. An arrest warrant was issued for Vernon regarding the 2 murders, and the manhunt was on. It's reported that he was last seen heading north on Highway 95 in a late 1980s maroon Toyota Camry. Authorities would spend 2 days searching the area surrounding the roadways north of the city of Coeur d'Alene, but they wouldn't find the fugitive. Naturally, an alert was raised nationwide, as well as in Canada, in order to find him. Though they assume he is on the run, they haven't dismissed the possibility that Vernon has taken his own life. We have only supposition at this time as to where or what this guy is doing. All you can do is evaluate what you would do if you're in his situation. The motives for the double murder is unclear. The official reports I've had a chance to read don't indicate any specific motive or even what the argument was about. However, I've come across posts from online Idaho communities which state that that night they were arguing about a date that the 18-year-old daughter went on, or at least something relating to her dating life. The wiki article for this case is incredibly specific in this regard, though. Quote, Connie Marie Henry said she had had enough of Vernon being controlling and acting violent toward her and the children. She threatened leaving Vernon at that point. This was right after Heather Janee, age 17 or 18, arrived home from a night with her boyfriend. But at this time, I hadn't found any official source which mentions anything even close to that specificity. Even the source cited for this section of the article doesn't actually mention these details. All we can really have some certainty of is that there was an argument. That being said, it's been reported that when the police investigated the home further, they found some evidence that the shootings were premeditated. But it hasn't been made known to the public what that evidence is, as far as I can tell. To make matters worse, Vern was actually known to be a survivalist. So it's not unlikely that he would be able to actually survive out in the woods to make his escape. And if the murders were planned, then it's even more likely that he would have stashed supplies somewhere in the woods for such an occasion. As far as his possible whereabouts are concerned, police have stated that he has family members all over the US, which could potentially be harboring him. Some of these family members have assisted police, though, in their search for the man, and it would appear that they've mostly been cleared of suspicion for this investigation. They've noted the possibility he could have fled to Belize, as actually he was known to mention his desire to travel there pretty frequently. And of course, it's quite possible he's in Canada, as again, he was last seen driving north on the highway towards the country. It's interesting to note, however, that on October 3rd, 2007, the Coeur d'Alene Press published an article stating that Coeur d'Alene FBI Supervisory Agent Don Robinson said there is a reason to believe Henry is back in North Idaho, and he hopes somebody can help locate him. At the time of making this video, he still hasn't been caught. That's if he's still even alive. The public's reaction of the case is understandably one of horror and confusion. No one had seen or noticed any red flags in Vern's or the family's behavior at all. It's quite the opposite, actually. At worst, the family was described as quiet by their landlord, who was also their fellow Bible study attendee. Vernon was a regular at the Maxi Mart located across the street from his home. The day before the shooting, he would visit the store and strike up a conversation with one of the workers whom he knew, with nothing seeming out of the ordinary. He was just in a really good mood, Blanchard said. He was just a really mellow person, she said, pausing and then adding, he must not have been to shoot his wife and daughter. The loss of Connie and Heather was felt deeply by the community. Connie ran a small babysitting business from the home, and Heather worked summers at the Silverwood theme park. Heather's boss would describe her as always smiling and joyful. At no point did either of them seem to have problems at home, and the police had no record of domestic violence in the household. All that the community is left with is the not-so-simple question of why. It's the natural question to have, but it's the kind of question that doesn't have a satisfying answer, as no answer will bring back the innocent lives lost that night. Our next case brings us back to 1800s America. A Swedish girl named Henrietta Clausen was 18 years old when she first arrived to the United States in 1887. First arriving in Omaha, Nebraska, an illness and other various circumstances would lead her to reside in Salt Lake City, Utah. Having no relatives in the country, she would instead find security and community through her church, the Scandinavian Methodist Episcopal Church. She would make many friends and gain a reputation for being trustworthy and helpful. She would even be hired to assist with the odd job around the church from time to time. She was living in the city for around 5 years when it was announced the church would be receiving a new reverend. Reverend Herman was a well-respected pastor at the Scandinavian Church in Wisconsin. He'd recently gotten married, and the couple decided to move to Salt Lake City to start their lives together. Henrietta and the Herman family would become fast friends. They would often help each other out and perform church work together. Not long after arriving to Salt Lake City, the Reverend and his wife would have a baby. But a few weeks after, tragically, both his wife and child would pass away, though the exact cause of death was unknown. I mean, it was the 1800s after all. For the next 2 years, the Reverend would sometimes ask Henrietta for assistance with the church. For example, in September of that year, Reverend Herman would need to travel to a church conference in the East, and so he would hire Henrietta to look after the parsonage or clergy house in his absence. Something strange happened a few days after the Reverend returned, though. On that day, Henrietta would tell her friend, Mrs. H. Peterson, who lived in the north side of the church, that she was going to go downtown to meet a good friend of hers named Mrs. Hanson. She would mention that she would be back for the evening service. Henrietta would also inform Mrs. Peterson that on the following day, she was going to go visit some friends in the countryside for a few days. And with that, she left for town. Come evening time, Mrs. Peterson would be otherwise preoccupied and unable to attend the service, unfortunately. Reverend Herman would speak with the church janitor, one Mr. Johnson, and request that he clean out the heating furnace in the basement and prepare it for a fire. And at first, Mr. Johnson would find this a bit strange. The furnace hadn't been used in quite some time, and while it had, at one point in time, been used to warm the church building, it was also the cause of a really big fire that nearly burned down the entire church. Since then, there had been several stoves that had been placed throughout the building to provide heat in the needed areas. But besides all of that, it was already a pretty hot day, so it just didn't quite make sense to him. Reverend Herman would inform Mr. Johnson, not to worry. He just wanted to make sure that the pipes were still working, just in case they needed them when winter finally rolled around. Seemingly satisfied with the explanation and not really feeling like pushing the issue further, Mr. Johnson would oblige and begin cleaning out the furnace. Once he was finished cleaning everything, he carried 6 buckets of coal into the basement, preparing to start the fire. But before he could start it, the Reverend would actually tell him not to worry and that he would take care of starting the fire himself. The residents living on the grounds remember the fire the Reverend started that day. It was uncomfortably hot, leaving them confused why they would see the Reverend hauling more and more and more bags of coal into the basement to throw into the furnace. It was hot enough. But that wasn't the worst part. No, the thing that really bothered the residents was the smell. They knew the furnace hadn't been used in a long while, but the smell was pretty unbearable. A young boy living on the grounds would actually fall unconscious due to the heat and odor, and so his family would have to splash water on him to wake him up. The boy's parents would then go into the basement to voice their protest, but the Reverend would keep this fire going until 6 p.m. that evening, spending the whole time alone in the basement. A little over a week later, Henrietta's friends were excitedly waiting her return, but she never came. It's strange. She had told Miss Peterson that on the 29th that she was just going to visit a friend and then come to the service that evening and then leave the following day, just for a few days. But when church members now learned of those plans, they were confused by this because, according to them, she never came to service that evening. Worriedly, everyone in the church would mobilize and ask around for her. Days turned into weeks, but no one had seen or even heard from her. It was like she had just vanished. Until one day, Reverend Herman would state that he just found out where she is. This next part has some conflicting reports. It's said that the Reverend received a letter from Henrietta wherein she stated where she'd gone off to, and other reports indicate that he saw her himself. But what the reports agree on is essentially that Reverend Herman claimed that Henrietta was now working at a brothel in Montana. Regardless, this would be seen as something very out of the ordinary by people who knew her. But according to the Reverend, actually, this wasn't entirely unusual for her. Fellow church member Mrs. Peterson would recall that on one occasion, Reverend Herman would tell her that Henrietta made advances towards him. Mrs. Peterson would state upon hearing this that she didn't think it was very nice of him to say that. Miss Clausen was a good girl, and she cared a great deal for Mr. Herman. And so that was basically the end of it. People do unexpected things all the time, right? Who's to say that she didn't really decide to let go of her religiosity and run off to a new city, searching for a new life? Somewhere in the last months of the year, Reverend Herman would get engaged to a Miss Samuelson. Annie Samuelson was a member of Herman's church and had been working as a nursery governess for a well-off family. Having grown enamored with the charming Reverend Herman, she would leave her job and home to move in with him after getting engaged. It would be some time before the two would settle on a date for the marriage. On February 28, 1896, Miss Samuelson would tell her friends and church members that tomorrow would be the big day. Tonight, they would be heading north to Ogden and tie the knot the next day, a sort of destination wedding, if you will. Though from my understanding, it was to be more of a pen and paper wedding, as reports don't seem to indicate any plans for a wedding ceremony, and therefore no invitees. It's reported that the next morning, a member of the church named Mr. Hansen would be walking around the church when he would see Reverend Herman going about his day. But he was alone. Mr. Hansen would ask the Reverend about Miss Samuelson's whereabouts, to which the Reverend responded that actually she was still in Ogden, and he wasn't sure when she was going to come back. It would be months before the real answer to that became apparent. It's moments like this that get a little frustrating when researching a story. From all the newspaper articles I've read, this is all that's reported regarding this conversation. I mean, I'd have to imagine that anyone would say, "What do you mean your new bride has decided to stay in a different city for an undetermined amount of time?" How is that a normal thing to say? And how did Mr. Hansen respond to this? I feel like when you're trying to look at the full picture here, missing details like this can be a bit frustrating. Anyway, rant over. Reverend Herman would depart the city to attend a church conference in Kansas City, using the opportunity to raise funds for the church. In his absence, he would personally request a pastor to come fill in for him, to which he would agree. However, Reverend Herman would probably regard appointing this specific pastor to be his biggest mistake. The reports indicate that, as it turns out, this new pastor was actually friends with Henrietta Clausen, and he was never quite satisfied with the accepted explanation of her disappearance. Around May 20th, 1896, a few weeks after Herman departed to Kansas City, the new pastor found himself in the church's decrepit basement, and then he began looking around, eventually making his way to the furnace. He grabbed hold of the rusty furnace door and opened it, and he peered inside, at first not seeing anything, when suddenly something caught his eye at the bottom of the furnace. It looked like there was something in the ashtray, but he couldn't immediately make out what it was, as there was the grate in the way. He removed the ashtray to get a better look, and after brushing away the ash, though these items had been badly burned, it was obvious what they were. The pastor found the following: 2 straight razors, a butcher knife, a garter belt, a belt buckle, and bones. Disturbed by these findings, he would contact police. The authorities would come and investigate the scene, cataloging the items and sending the bones off to physicians for examination. While inspecting the scene, they would also take a closer look at the furnace door and note that what likely appeared to be rust was actually blood. The physician inspecting the blood wasn't confident enough to say if the blood was human or animal, though. But the retrieved bones were much easier to identify. A clavicle, human, female. More than 6 physicians came to the same assessment separately, and also identified another 12 to 15 pieces of ribs and around 8 to 10 pieces of vertebrae, also female. Wanting to be thorough, the police would actually begin excavating the soft ground of the basement, and would find a pair of bloody overalls that looked exactly like a pair that the Reverend Herman would use. He would use these whenever he had to perform labor work around the property. A barrel in the basement was also reported to have large bloodstains, but only on the top side. They would also find cut marks on that side of the barrel, as if someone was using it as a cutting board. Artificial teeth would also be found, and Henrietta Clausen's dentist would be contacted to determine if they belonged to the woman. He would confirm that they were hers. Authorities would also be able to identify the razors and knife as belonging to Reverend Herman, and the buckles as belonging to Miss Clausen. With all of these revelations, it was clear who the responsible party was. The evidence painted a clear picture. After murdering Henrietta Clausen on September 29th, Reverend Herman would plan on disposing of her body the next day. Dressed in his usual work overalls, he placed her body in a coal sack and brought it down to the basement. The coal likely masked the smell of death. The furnace had a small door, about 10 by 6 inches, so too small to pass a body through. So he would use a barrel as a butcher's block, breaking the body of Miss Clausen down and passing it through the door into the hot fire. The horrid smell reported that night was the smell of the burning corpse. In light of these discoveries, it was official. Reverend Herman was now a wanted man. Naturally, there lingers an obvious begging question. No one has seen Annie Samuelson since her supposed wedding. Did he kill her too? Police certainly suspected so, and would search the basement and church grounds with the assumption that they would find her remains. But they didn't find anything. The news of Henrietta's murder and Annie's disappearance would shock the public, and some answers regarding Annie Samuelson's disappearance would soon come forward. When the Reverend first left to Kansas City a couple weeks prior, he would make a stop in Washington, D.C. to visit a fellow Reverend, Mr. Ephraim. Reverend Herman would come bearing gifts. He gifted clothing and other various articles to Reverend Ephraim's wife, stating that these belonged to his, quote, deceased wife. The news of the murders would strike a chord with Reverend Ephraim's wife. Upon hearing all of this, she would retrieve the gifts, inspect them closely, and sure enough, there it was, and the letters AKS monogrammed into them. It was common practice at this time to monogram various items, like handkerchiefs, to identify the owner. When she first received these items, she likely just assumed they belonged to his wife, who passed away when they moved out to Salt Lake City. But now it was clear, AKS. Annie K. Samuelson. The police would investigate Reverend Herman's whereabouts before departing on his trip, and they would find out that a few days prior to Annie's disappearance, Reverend Herman went to a lumberyard, and he commissioned the construction of a fairly large trunk. The Reverend made some trips out to the city after Annie's disappearance, and on some of these trips, he traveled with 2 trunks, one of which was the one he had commissioned. As it turns out, during his trips, Reverend Herman would gift and sell various women's clothing and jewelry. Not long after the news of his crimes were public, many of these items would be identified as having belonged to Miss Clausen and Miss Samuelson. It's believed on one of these trips, even possibly his most recent departure to Kansas City, the Reverend used the opportunity to dispose of Miss Samuelson's body. And while they were investigating Reverend Herman, it became unfortunately clear that he was responsible for a few more than these 2 murders. His first wife passed away again under suspicious circumstances in England. While working as a pastor in Wisconsin from around 1890 to 1891, he would get married for a second time. And less than a year after that marriage, his wife and 2-week-old baby would pass away. This death would actually rouse suspicion and would be cause for investigation, but no indication of foul play was ever found. Not long after, he would marry for a 3rd time, and this was the wife that he had when he first moved to Salt Lake City. And as we know, her and her baby would pass away as well. The Reverend had been married 3 times, and in all 3 of those marriages, his wife would pass away, usually under mysterious circumstances. In total, he would be implicated in the murders of 7 people. Some newspapers would liken the Reverend to that of H.H. Holmes. At this time in American history, people were still reeling from the horrific crimes of the H.H. Holmes case, and so naturally some newspapers would liken the Reverend to the infamous criminal. Often referred to as America's first serial killer, H.H. Holmes is credited by some researchers to have murdered anywhere from 20 to 200 people. His suspected crime spree took place between 1886 and 1894. It's a little disconcerting that this means that the 2 of them were criminally active at the same time. And oddly enough, H.H. Holmes would be executed the same day that Reverend Herman left for Kansas City, the same day that he fled. Before making the case public, the police naturally investigated in secret, and knowing that he was in Kansas City, the police would coordinate with the Kansas City authorities, only to find that he was not in the city anymore. And in fact, the Salt Lake Herald newspaper would contact Kansas City officials inquiring of Herman's whereabouts, and they would respond by stating, "If Francis Herman is in the city, he is undercover. He's not registered at any first-class or second-class hotels on the present date or May 7th. A kind of public manhunt went underway, with the occasional newspaper articles announcing that authorities had confirmed sightings of the man in various cities. On June 5th, the St. Louis authorities would state that after passing through St. Louis, he was likely staying in either Cincinnati or Indianapolis, disguised as a florist. For the next year or so, many people would be arrested under the suspicion of being Reverend Herman, but all would be determined not to be the man and subsequently let go. It would seem that the last reference to the Reverend was in 1897 regarding one of the previously mentioned suspects being let go. Reverend Francis Herman would never be found, and the moniker of the Priestly Butcher lives on in infamy. Our next story will take us to South America and to the lush and sunny country of Brazil. 1992 was a time of political unrest, but despite that, as in any period of strife, there will always be moments of joy and celebration. It's November 28th, and it's the wedding of bride and groom Isabel and Eli. The couple are walking towards the altar hand in hand. Planning the wedding was very stressful, but with every step towards the altar, the stress turns to excitement. Finally, the couple would start the first day of the rest of their lives together. Following behind the couple was the groom's father, Mr. Murat, and his father's new girlfriend. Eli had some initial misgivings when his father first began dating this woman 3 months ago due to their age gap. Eli's father was 84, and his girlfriend, Heloisa, was 42. Mr. Murat was a healthy merchant who had moved to Brazil from Lebanon, and Eli felt that she was probably with him for his money. Despite this, though, she seemed to make his father happy, and how could he really argue with that? He would have to push his feelings to the side today anyway. It was a day for him and his wife, a day of celebration. The wedding would go off without a hitch, and many months later, the couple would welcome a son into the world. 10 days after the birth of his grandson, Eli's father was at a beach in Rio with a good friend of his. And taking in the sun, good company, and happy about the new family member, Mr. Murad was enjoying a beautiful day when suddenly an unknown man had just exited a taxi, walked towards the two men, brandished a gun, and shot them both to death. The man would flee the scene and never be caught. Shocked, saddened, and enraged, Eli had to get to the bottom of his father's murder. But where would he start? After the murder, Eli would trust his gut and decide that Eloisa, his father's girlfriend, definitely had something to do with it. As the son of a merchant and currently working as a business administrator, Eli would have no problem hiring private detectives to look into her. Eli and the detectives had no idea that they were about to uncover a trail of carnage that would go back 20 years. Over her life, Eloisa has changed her name many times, but originally she was born as Eloisa Borba Gonçalves. Born March 13th, 1950, and by age 19, she would have her first child with boyfriend Carlos Pinto da Silva. Roughly around this time, she would actually begin a simultaneous relationship with a German doctor, Gunther Jörg Wolf. On December 27th, 1971, Eloisa and the doctor were on vacation when they would tragically get into a car accident when they collided with a truck. Eloisa was 4 months pregnant with the doctor's child, but both her and the child survived the crash. 38-year-old Gunther was unfortunately not so lucky and perished in the crash. Eloisa was not one to miss a good business opportunity, and following the birth of her daughter, she would register her daughter with her late father's name. Of course, this would be in an attempt to have the child inherit her father's assets. However, the doctor's family would appeal this decision. Though unsuccessful, it unfortunately only marked the beginning of a pattern for Eloisa, a lawyer by trade, and her romantic partners. At some point afterwards, she would decide to marry Carlos Pinto da Silva, the father of her first child. The newlyweds would welcome their second child into the world, though this would actually be Eloisa's third child. On December 20th, 1977, they would go on a family vacation in Salvador. While they were staying at their hotel, an apparent robbery attempt would be made, which resulted in Carlos getting shot 5 times in the chest while in the hotel doorway. Luckily, somehow, Carlos would make a full recovery, having a peculiar statement to make when he was conscious again. Carlos stated that Eloisa was the one responsible for the attempt on his life. To repeat, an unknown assailant was the one who shot Carlos, but he was absolutely convinced that Eloisa had hired the shooter to kill him. The strange part is that not long after making the accusation, Carlos would decide not to press charges. It's unclear why. Not long after that, it seems that they got divorced, as any mention of them being together ends after this event. I suppose it's fair to call it quits after your wife calls a hit on you. In 1981, now 33 years old, Eloisa would give birth to her 4th child, but only married the father in May of 1983. And it seemed that Eloisa had a certain type, as her new husband, Irineu Suarez, was the wealthy owner of an insurance company. Despite knowing her for only over 2 years, it was only 5 months after their marriage that harm would come Irineu's way. In October of that year, the couple would be victims of a robbery, which resulted in Irineu being shot twice in the chest. She, however, would come out of it unscathed. Tragically, Irineu's injuries were too severe and he would pass away. This would be the first time Eloisa became a widow. As part of their marriage contract, Eloisa and Irineu had signed a nuptial pact of total communion of assets, meaning that both parties shared legal ownership of every asset they both had, even if they were acquired prior to the marriage. In addition to a large sum of money, Eloisa would inherit several cars and 2 properties in Rio. At this point, there's been enough chaos following Eloisa to last a lifetime, but it seems she was not content with her ill-gotten gains. She still wanted more. Somewhere in the later half of the 1980s, she would get married again to 2 different men at the same time. Military police officer Roberto de Souza Lopez and Army Lieutenant Colonel Jorge Ribeiro. Jorge Ribeiro was known by everyone as the King of Telephones. This was because he was the owner of many telephone lines and made his wealth buying and selling them. She would give birth to her 5th child in 1987 with Jorge. As a lawyer, she would have known she's breaking the law simply being married to 2 different people at the same time, but on May 8th, 1990, she would marry a 3rd man, At 71 years old, Nicolaus Saad was a businessman from Syria who had just recently retired to enjoy his millions in his older age. The same year she married Saad, she would give birth to her sixth child. Naturally, being in several relationships at the same time, it's not actually immediately obvious who the father was. And to make it worse, she would go on to separately register the child's father as both Ribeiro and Saad. It's important to remember that at this time, most of the government records are only on paper instead of computers, which are still a new technology. As such, these kind of things were easy enough to get away with, as someone would have to have these records in hand and have the idea to compare them, which they would have to do manually. And on December 29th, 1991, a year and a half after getting married to Heloisa, Saad would be found dead in his apartment, seemingly of cardiac arrest. One of the most absurd aspects of this case is what Heloisa would actually tell his family about how he died. And according to Saad's family, at one point she would say he was hit by a bus. Seemingly realizing that that would sound ridiculous if they found out where his body was found and in what condition, she would change her story and say actually he choked on orange juice. After further investigation, it was found that at the time of his death, his arm had been broken. At the time, it wasn't something considered that suspicious. Perhaps during his heart attack, he panicked and stumbled, and, in his old age, he would have more brittle bones, etc. At this point, many people theorize that he may have been forced to ingest poison under physical violence, and this would explain the broken bone and the apparent heart attack. Additionally, it may also explain why Heloisa shared these conflicting causes of death with Saad's family. Thinking of the broken bone, she might try to use this as evidence of being hit by a bus. Or, that's the only explanation she could think of. Then deciding that that was a bad excuse, she would then think of, okay, the ingesting of poison and say, oh, well, actually, he just choked on orange juice. But who's to say what the truth is really? At the end of the day, it doesn't really change the outcome. As Saad's widow, she would inherit several pieces of real estate in Rio. And by 1992, Heloisa and Jorge Ribeiro would get divorced. However, with Heloisa being a lawyer, she knew that there was still a way to get what she wanted from him. While Ribeiro was waiting for job candidates in his Copacabana office, an unknown assailant would attack the man. He was gagged, bound, and forced to lay on his stomach on the ground. And in a needlessly brutal manner, the assailant would execute Ribeiro by smashing his head with a sledgehammer. Reportedly, Heloisa assisted the killer in making their escape. But of course, she was not a suspect at this time. After his death, she would inherit over 1,000 telephone lines, as well as the nickname Queen of Telephones, a play on the nickname of her late husband. And then in November of that year, she would again marry the Lebanese merchant, Mr. Murad, the merchant who would be shot and killed and whose son, Eli, would subsequently investigate Heloisa. That brings us to where we first started in this video. Eli would spend months with this investigation, but somehow, unbeknownst to him, Heloisa had discovered that he was having her investigated. On October 11th, 1993, Eli was driving with police officer Luis Marquez de Mota, a detective he had hired to assist with the investigation into his father's death. And while the two were on their way to the local police station, a car would ambush them and 2 gunmen would fire on them. And tragically, Officer Luis was killed after suffering 3 gunshot wounds. Eli himself would be shot twice in the back of the neck and head, but Eli would be rushed to the hospital, and after 2 weeks in the ICU, he miraculously managed to recover. After recovering from those injuries, if bringing Heloisa down wasn't personal before, it definitely was now. Eli would work with lawyers, and eventually they would be able to bring forth an aggravated murder charge for the murder of Jorge Ribeiro. Of course, her list of victims is much, much larger, but given that she never carried out the killings herself, it was likely that the prosecution felt that the Ribeiro murder case was the one they were most confident they could win. She was set to appear in front of a jury for August of 2005, but she was able to appeal the date and have it postponed to January of 2006. Her first trial was scheduled for January of 2008, but again, she was able to get it postponed to March of that year, and then again, she would get the date postponed to May. It's reported that in 2010, Heloisa would go into hiding. She would actually have 2 warrants put out for her arrest, and the prosecution would request the public, send any information that would assist in locating her. In August of 2011, after still being unable to find her, it was decided that she would be tried in absentia. This resulted in a conviction and sentencing of 18 years in prison. In 2011, Interpol issued an arrest warrant, but as of recording this video, she still has never been found. Interpol says that she has managed to stay on the run due to her numerous different identities, reportedly having at least 8 different names. And through the use of wealth she's accumulated over the years, as well as possibly with the assistance of her family, who are located all around the world. Interpol reported that her last sighting was in Florida, actually, back in May of 2010, but she has family located in several other states as well. It's reported that after all the murders and inheritance scams she has orchestrated, it's estimated that the assets inherited by it reached the value of 20 million reals. But I've seen other reports with estimates as high as double that, at 40 million. It's worth noting that according to the accounts of those who met her, Heloisa was always incredibly kind, soft-spoken, helpful, and seemingly just a nice person to be around. And it's likely that this was the reason she was able to avoid suspicion for so long. Heloisa Gonçalves would be dubbed by the press as the Black Widow, as this species of spider is known to murder the male after copulation. She's wanted in over 188 countries, but currently in her 70s, it's unclear if she'll ever face justice. Cults are a fascinating part of human history. They've been around as long as humans have. In modern times, the term cult has a lot of negative baggage associated with it, but it's interesting to note that this wasn't always the case. Though the term has a loose definition, if you go back far enough, it's used to describe people who sometimes went further or had more specific practices in regards to worship within a population's common religion. A cult of Athena in ancient Greece wasn't a surprise, and it was probably kind of expected. The term has kind of evolved to have negative connotations after cults would be involved in tragic events of mass death. Cults like the Solar Temple, Om Shinrikyo, and infamous People's Temple of Jonestown are examples of contributors to the perception shift, although it's arguable that, cults, the environment, kind of lead to these kinds of things. The Jonestown massacre was, of course, especially heinous due to the sheer number of victims. However, recently I've learned of another cult whose history rivals that of the People's Temple of Jonestown, which I feel is oddly under-discussed. Not that it hasn't been discussed, but I just feel like it's under-discussed. Our next story takes us to East Africa, to a country with one of the greatest flags, Uganda. Uganda is actually a very religious country. A 2014 census recorded that only 0.2% of the population identified as non-religious. 84% of the population identified under some branch of Christianity. In 2001, the editor of the Uganda newspaper, The Monitor, stated that every small town has got a small church, small sect, someone has set up shop there. There's much, much more than 200 churches, cults, and sects. The story begins with a man named Joseph Kibutere. He was known in his community for being a pious Catholic who helped those in need. A churchgoer, a man who tended to the sick, an owner of a Catholic school, and a husband of 40 years, as well as a father of 16 children, he was very well known and extremely respected in the community. One day, Joseph would be approached by three strange women who came with an even stranger claim. These three women mentioned they were leaders of a Catholic sect devoted to the worship of the Virgin Mary. Not only would they say they were devoted to Mary, but one of the women, a woman named Credonia Marinde, would actually tell Joseph that she had been visited by Mary herself. She would go further and state that Mary had instructed her to bring herself and her two companions to visit Joseph, and that Joseph would take them in, shelter them, and join them in their mission. This claim would actually strike a chord with Joseph, as just a few years prior, in 1984, Joseph himself claimed to have had a vision of the Virgin Mary as well. And so, believing this was indeed a divine command, Joseph would go ahead and invite the women to live with him and his family. Over time, word would spread about the women and Joseph, and many Christians would come to ask to join them and live on Joseph's farm as well. Eventually, the farm would be home to over 200 followers. Credonia would claim to be receiving instructions from Mary. The new church would place an emphasis on following every single word that Credonia would say. Honestly, everything was going smooth at first, but things would eventually take a turn when Credonia would begin implementing harsh punitive measures for people who were maybe not as devoted as others, and that included the family of Joseph himself. Some of these punishments were physical beatings, and other would be withholding food from these, so-called weak faith followers. With tensions growing between Joseph's family and this emerging church he's now a part of, his family would eventually manage to kick the church off of their property. To the family's dismay, Joseph would actually follow the church and leave home. This church sect, now calling themselves the Movement for the Restoration of the Ten Commandments of God, would buy a new plot of land to build their church on. It's reported that around this time, as part of indoctrination, followers would be given a questionnaire to fill out, which included asking if the person would be willing to die for their faith, which is something that, in retrospect, would be a sign of unfortunate foreshadowing. After establishing their new base of operations, they began proselytizing in neighboring areas, carrying a very dire message. The sect had declared that the world would end in the year 2000.
There still exists a general state of either denial, complacency, or even apathy about both the reality and the potential effects of Y2K.
The basic idea on Y2K was that for convenience, all these computer programs, when it came to do dates, you only needed 2 numbers. Why use 4 numbers when you only need 2? And then they recognized, what date is a computer going to think it is when we get to 2000?
At the stroke of midnight, January 1st, 2000, elevators may stop. Heat may vanish. Credit cards and ATMs may cease to function. Airplanes and trains may come to a halt.
This is not one of the summer movies where you can close your eyes during the scary parts.
At a glance, it's easy to jump to the conclusion that this date would have been inspired by the Y2K panic. But to many of the church followers, this date also just felt right. It's important to note that around this time of the church's founding and operations, the Catholic Church had been embroiled in many controversies, with many priests involved in scandals. Not to mention, in the 1980s to 90s, Uganda was actually dealing with an HIV/AIDS epidemic that devastated the country. To many of the church followers, it really did look like things were headed for the end. The church's message was fairly simple: repent and follow the 10 Commandments, and you will achieve salvation. In practice, though, the church would make harsh demands of its followers. They were asked to sell off most, if not all, of their belongings, and to give the money to the church.
They also had one common practice, that whenever you reached this place, you would remove all your clothes and surrender them to them, so that they give you a common dress. I think this was meant purposely to ensure that members don't escape.
Fasting was an everyday requirement, with Mondays and Fridays having a daily limit of 1 meal. Hard labor in the fields and harvesting crops were the main responsibilities. And to top it off, things like soap and sex were prohibited. Followers compared their daily life to that of prison and slavery. It wouldn't be long before it really took a mental toll on them. Even though Joseph was supposed to be the leader, many followers would describe Cordonia as the real head of the church. And this was likely because she was the one who was receiving visions from Mary and would then hand down rules. And of course, these rules were supposedly from Mary herself. In spite of everything, membership would grow fairly quickly. And by 1997, they had around 5,000 members. And by the time December rolled around, members had given away all of their clothes and replaced it with black and green uniforms in preparation for the final day. January 1st came and went without the world ending, as you may know. And this led to confusion and anger amongst church members. Tensions would begin to rise as members began to leave the church or demand repayment, since they'd given all of their possessions to the church or sold them, and then gave the church the proceeds. Oddly enough, other members noticed that the ones who asked for repayment would no longer be seen on church grounds. But not because they had left the church, rather they seemed to have simply disappeared without a word to anyone. Honestly, it's not really clear what the church told their followers at this time, but after the failed prophecy, they did what many other doomsday predictors do when the inevitable day comes and goes. They just rescheduled it. And so the church planned a large multi-day celebration in March where they would welcome the end of the world, the new end of the world. The plan for the event was that it would go from the 15th to the 18th, and interestingly, the church actually invited the local authorities to join them in their celebrations, specifically only on the 18th though. In any case, on the 15th, the celebrations began, with members reportedly feasting on roasted bulls and soft drinks. March 17th saw the largest amount of members gathering at the chapel to celebrate. At 12:45 p.m., police would receive a devastating phone call. The chapel had caught fire, and there were people still inside. After the blaze was out, investigators would count a death toll of 330, though that number was later increased to 530. Naturally, the first question to be addressed was, how did the fire start? It was quite obvious to not be a case of a natural fire, so maybe it was an accident. Investigators would discover that prior to the celebration, one of the church priests purchased 50 liters of sulfuric acid, which is now what's believed to have been used as the accelerant for the fire. What's also interesting is that investigators would find that most of the bodies showed no signs of violence or struggle, which is a little strange when you try to imagine what that practically looks like, as dying in a fire is one of the most painful ways to go. The investigators' leading theory is that they consumed poison prior to the fire, and so they were likely incapacitated or had already perished before being burned. Initially, investigators would rule this as a case of mass suicide, but it wasn't long before more evidence would begin to paint a different picture. Early on in the investigation, it was noted that the doors and windows to the chapel had been nailed shut. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean the people inside weren't there of their own choosing, but it isn't really implying that they were given the option of leaving, does it?
Now, it's worth mentioning that I feel this information conflicts a little with previous statements regarding the state of the victims. While the New York Times article I'm referencing mentioned investigators seeing little signs of struggle, eyewitness accounts state that there were concentrations of bodies near the exits, near the doors, which implies there was some bit of a struggle to get out. But the entrances had been nailed and blocked, so there was no way. They must have suffered. The statement recorded in the New York Times article seems to imply that potentially only a few people attempted to flee, while most of them didn't, maybe due to poisoning. As we can see, eyewitness accounts and other reports seem to indicate that the opposite is true. Most people tried to escape, but ultimately couldn't.
The massive fire prompted investigation and excavation of the church and its grounds. Shockingly, several clandestine graves would be found. The location of these graves ranged from pits and banana fields to beneath concrete below a priest's dressing room, and even underneath the church's latrine pits. These discoveries would solve the mystery of where the disappeared church members had gone. But it was more than just that. Some of the bodies were family members of those church members. Investigators would discover bodies of small children and pregnant women in these graves as well. It was determined that the majority of the victims had been poisoned, while others were potentially strangled. And they think this because they had found rope fibers around their necks. Hundreds of bodies would be found, and authorities are not sure that they'd even found them all. The bodies inside the church, as well as the bodies inside these graves, would bring the total death toll to 924. Furthermore, testimonies of church members who didn't participate in the celebration would indicate that there was no discussion of any kind of mass suicide planned. It was simply supposed to be a gathering wherein they would be in company during those end times. And so this changes the narrative of what was initially thought to have occurred that day, as well as the time leading up to it. After the failed doomsday, many followers of the church would begin to question the church's authority and ask for repayment. These church members and even some of their family members would be killed for this, and their bodies disposed of. At the same time, the church schedules a new date for the end of the world, planning on a mass killing of the remaining members. So the church leaders likely tricked everyone into drinking poison, nailed the windows and doors shut, and set the building ablaze.
I want to take this opportunity to clarify that while I've mainly been focusing on Credonia and Joseph as the two main perpetrators, there are actually several other church leaders who are also culpable. Reports vary, but it seems either 5 or 6 of the church leaders total are held responsible.
Now, I imagine you're probably thinking, at least the evil church leaders aren't able to hurt anyone anymore, but there's a problem with that. Maybe you forgot the title of the video.
The authorities were unable to identify basically any of the bodies found due to how badly burned they were. As a result, they couldn't confirm if any of the church leaders were among the dead.
In fact, church members who were in the area that day of the fire, but by various circumstances weren't actually inside the church, would state that not only was Joseph not there at any point, but some members even saw Credonia running away from the fire, headed towards the fields. No one knew where they were. And as you may imagine, to this day, we still do not have any information or indication of where they may have gone. For what it's worth, one of Joseph's sons would be convinced that one of the bodies in the church belonged to his father. So at best, this still means that Credonia still made it out alive and has been on the run ever since. It's an absolutely horrific case. And it's just incredibly shocking that we don't know the fate of the two main perpetrators. I mean, can you imagine being a family member of one of the victims? It's one thing to think that your family was convinced to take their own life by someone else, and the one who convinced them was too cowardly to follow through themselves. It's totally different when new evidence seems to indicate that they were probably murdered instead, and their killer vanished. It's not every day you come across a case that makes your skin crawl, quite like the case of Louise Bowe. Louise was born June 21st, 1939, to humble farmers Florinda and Vittoria. As he would grow up into a young man, he would gain a positive reputation for his great strength and knowledge of plants and medicine. It was commonplace for him to assist the injured and ill using traditional medicine and giving blessings. At around the age of 28, his parents would sadly pass away. This meant that the ownership of the family farm would pass on to his older brother, Joao. Louise was not happy with this arrangement and would get into an argument with his brother regarding his inheritance. This is because Louise believed the farm should go to him instead. Naturally, his brother didn't agree, and their argument escalated into a full-on brawl. In the struggle, Joao would hit Louise with a hammer, and Louise retaliated by grabbing the family shotgun and firing at his brother. Joao would be struck in his eye, arm, and leg. He would survive these wounds, but they would leave permanent scars. After this encounter, Louise would move in with his uncle, who was also a farmer, and work as a farmhand on his property. It seemed things were looking up for Louise, as he would actually get married to a fellow farmhand on October 7th, 1967. The exact details are unknown, but reports indicate that by 1972, the couple were divorced. It's alleged that Louise was abusive and was gaining a community reputation of being a thief. It's also rumored that Louise contracted mumps at this time, which had left him sterile, and so his wife had divorced him. Likely feeling that there was no longer a place for him here, he would decide to move again. Louise would move in with a widow named Maria Zarpellon. After her husband's passing, Maria needed help with the family farm, as she had many mouths to feed, being the mother of 17 children. At this time, Louise was still known to be a very skilled farmhand, and so based on this reputation, Maria would accept his help. Maria's 12th child, Francisco, had suffered from asthma, and so given his background in herbs and medicine, Louise would begin treating the 12-year-old boy basically right after moving in. They began spending a lot of time together due to the treatments, and during this time, Louise would grow a pedophilic attraction to the boy and began grooming him. The rest of the family simply thought they were spending a lot of time together, again, simply due to his treatments, as they noted Louise seemed to have great care for the boy. It's reported that it was only after one of Francisco's older brothers moved back home after performing his military service that questions would be raised. This older brother became suspicious of their relationship and brought it up with the rest of the family. The family decided it would be best to send Francisco off to seminary school. On February 26, 1975, about a year after Louise moved in, Francisco's mother Maria decided that she would inform Louise about Francisco's departure. But before breaking the news, she first sent Francisco off on an errand to fetch flour from the local mill, and so Francisco set off on horseback. After his departure, Maria would tell Louise that they were sending Francisco away. It's reported that this angered Louise, though his anger seemed to be directed at the school rather than the family. Despite this upsetting news, he simply informed the family he would no longer be living there, but that he would leave some money for Francisco. And with that, Louise gathered his things and left. As the day went on, Maria noticed that Francisco was taking longer to come home than he should. She waited a bit longer, but eventually hours passed, and he hadn't returned. The family assumed that he must have slept over at a friend's house, which was not uncommon, and so they let it be for the night. The next day, they set off in search of Francisco, since he hadn't come back yet. While on their way to Francisco's friend's house, they actually bumped into Louise. Surprised, they would ask him, like, "Hey, have you seen Francisco? He's missing." Louise said he hadn't seen him, and so the family kept searching. Francisco hadn't slept over at a friend's house, and it seemed that everyone they asked hadn't seen him. Eventually, the family would ask the owner of a local grocer if he had seen Francisco, and the man would respond by telling them, yeah, actually he had. He saw him yesterday, sometime around past noon. And he would also tell them that when he saw him, Francisco was with Louise. Having just spoken to Louise and now knowing they've been lied to, they would tell the grocer what was going on and kind of raise some awareness to let them know that if they've seen Louise, since he quite clearly knows where their son is, to let them know. After speaking with the grocer, they headed back home, likely to gather some things, and set back out in search again. As soon as they arrived home, they were surprised to see that in front of their house was Francisco's horse. If you remember, Francisco rode his horse to the mill when he was running the errand. And in addition to Francisco having gone missing, the horse never came back either. Until now, that is. A horse without its rider is an uneasy sight in and of itself. But what made matters worse was that after they inspected the horse, they found blood on the reins. And so immediately they knew something was very wrong. With this new information, they were able to mobilize their community into searching for any signs of Francisco and Luis, but they were nowhere to be found. The local police department would search for 2 days before finding anything. On the second day, police would actually find Luis and detain him. It's unclear if he gave them information regarding the whereabouts of Francisco, but that same day, while the police were investigating the local chapel grounds, they would find a body wrapped in cloth, and they would identify it as Francisco. The body was in a horrible state, and it was clear he'd met a violent end. Police would interrogate Luis, who would eventually tell them what happened. The day that Luis was informed of Francisco's impending leave to seminary, Luis packed his things and left to find the boy. Of course, knowing where Francisco's destination was, it wasn't difficult to do. What happened next is extremely disturbing, and frankly, I'm not even sure how to say it, but consider this as a warning. The police report indicates that at this time, the following events took place. Luis would take the boy into the woods and sexually assault him, as he had done many times previously. Afterwards, he would stab the boy several times in the neck and chest, killing him. And if that wasn't enough, he then severed the boy's reproductive organ, and then using a stick he had scavenged, he shoved the organ into the body's anus. He then wrapped the body in cloth and deposited it on the chapel grounds. He chose this particular location as this was an attempt to try and pin the murder on the minister of the chapel, who, if you remember, he blamed for Francisco's departure to seminary school in the first place. Due to the grotesque and violent nature of the crime, they would have Luis psychologically evaluated, and he would be diagnosed with schizophrenia. On June 28, 1979, he would be found guilty of the murder of Francisco, and he would be sent to jail. However, the duration of the sentence brought up a lot of justified criticism, as he was sentenced to 4 years and 7 months in prison. I have to imagine that this reduced sentence was likely due to the mental diagnosis that he had received. His time in prison would be relatively uneventful. In fact, he was known by the guards for his good behavior, and everyone considered him to be a model prisoner, someone who kept to himself and didn't want to cause any trouble. Due to his farming skills, he was in charge of the prison garden, and so simply spent most of his days tending to it. His behavior and his green thumb were so well regarded that he was allowed to work in a prison colony outside the prison facility in order to tend to their crops. And it's reported that he would also work on a farm owned by the actual owner of the prison. On January 20th, 1980, at around noon, while working on this farm, he disappeared. Frustratingly, authorities didn't actually bother trying to recapture or search for him after his escape. During this time, locals of several different communities would make reports having spotted him or someone who looked like him. This would clue in local newspapers, and after investigation, they would break the news and report of Luis's escape from prison, though at this point it had already been nearly a month since that time. Given that Luis had a personal connection to the victim Francisco, some people likely thought that Francisco would be the only victim, but unfortunately he was only the first. On February 12, 1980, a 12-year-old boy was running some errands for his parents at a local shop. Unfortunately, he didn't return home that night. His family went out in search for him, and when they made it to the store he was sent to, the store informed them that the boy had indeed been there. He did purchase the items that he came for, and then he left. And so with this, the family was able to mobilize the community and organize a search party. Sometime in the afternoon, the next day, members of the search were looking in a nearby cornfield when they would spot a bloodstain on some of the corn. Following the trail led them to a clearing where on the ground was a bloody machete. And they would notice that the machete was placed on top of what was clearly some relatively freshly disturbed dirt. Removing this dirt would reveal the body of the young boy they had been searching for. Investigation would record that the boy's genitalia had been amputated and his sphincter had been ruptured. Since this MO was eerily similar to that of Luis's murder of Francisco, and again given that Luis had escaped prison, he was immediately the prime suspect for this murder. And at this point, a full-blown manhunt was underway. Newspapers all over were raising awareness, and local communities were on high alert. However, it being the early 80s and mostly being a rural area, It made it difficult to stay ahead of where Louise might go next, or even up to date with where he had been. It's also been reported that at this time, Louise would use disguises to try and pass through communities undetected, going as far as using wigs. On February 15th, so only 3 days after the second murder, two 8-year-old friends, Gelson Ribeiro and Paulo Grando, were herding cows on a neighbor's farm, not far from their homes. Later, when they didn't return home, a search was organized, and it was the next morning when the two bodies were found. The autopsies confirmed that they had similar wounds to the two previous victims of Louise Bao. It was clear that he was moving through communities quickly and would try to kill, leave the area, and then kill again as soon as possible. It was clear that these murders were not painstakingly planned out, but rather he would just seek out new victims and strike when the opportunity presented itself. In fact, the very next day, Louise attempted to capture and kill an 11-year-old. And I say attempted because the boy ran and Louise chased him, but the boy managed to make it to his father, so Louise simply gave up and ran away. The father would report this to the police, of course, who would show the boy a photo of Louise, and the boy would confirm that it was him who chased him. In addition to many different branches of civil police, Louise was also hunted by different branches of military police, and they were trying to track him down around the clock. On February 21st, 32 days since his escape from prison, Louise would be spotted walking along a major roadway after he had just purchased some food from a nearby store. Military police would be called in, and they actually would shoot at Louise, with one shot actually grazing him on the neck, but the rest missed the target. And then he ran into the woods, and so the officers chased him. One officer would actually physically engage him, resulting in that officer getting stabbed in the thigh. But he was eventually able to overcome Louise and knock him out. And so Louise was finally arrested and would be brought back to the military police base. When news broke of his capture, it's reported that around 500 people in the local community went to the police base and were publicly calling for them to hand over Louise so they could lynch him. The military police managed to escort Louise off the premises, and he was subsequently held in a psychiatric institute. On June 30th, 5 months after he arrived at the institute, 5 inmates would attempt to escape the facility, Louise being one of them. And 4 of them would be recaptured, but unfortunately, Louise had managed to escape captivity again. Since then, Louise was never heard from again. As far as authorities have been able to tell, he no longer lives in the area, and while he has a warrant out for his arrest, there doesn't seem to have been a sign from him. It's been theorized that he fled the country, but there are also rumors that he was actually captured by locals, who got what they were asking for outside the military police base. Ultimately, we'll never know for sure what happened to him, but during his murder spree, he had entire communities terrified and in a panic. And this, in combination with his disgusting MO, earned him the nickname of the Monster of Ereshim. Thanks for watching. Today we've covered 5 cases of killers who somehow managed to seemingly vanish into thin air. One can only wish that the victims mentioned in these cases rest in peace, and that these families can find solace in their memories. I hope you found these cases interesting. Let me know your thoughts on these cases in the comment section below. And the format for this video is a little different than usual, so if you would like more compilations or more dedicated videos, I'd love to hear your feedback.